Our topic tonight is the Obama foreign policy as a conservative internationalist view. We're firmly convinced that it's so important that we understand the underlying principles, tenets, and opinions lodged within the goals, lodged within the contemporary American foreign policy. And so to look at the Obama policy we consider to be a fundamental effort within our discussion of American foreign policy. Our guest tonight has written at least 4 articles for significant journals between 1910 and now on the Obama foreign policy. This is going back to the past, is that what we... I live in a house which was built in 1907. But in any case, the articles are 4 in number over the last 3 years or so. And probably of equal or greater importance, beyond his careful attention, scholarly attention to the Obama foreign policy, are the ideas that he brings to the table. He's taught a course on American foreign policy traditions, plural, for a number of years. He's written on this subject in a number of books over the past couple of decades. The themes of ideas and power and institutions appear in the subtitles of these works, which of course are central questions in any serious discussion of a particular foreign policy. So he brings scholarly attention to both the Obama foreign policy in particular and the broad questions of the nature of American foreign policy traditions. And his most recently published book, of course, deals with the question or deals with the subject of conservative internationalism as a description of a thread within American foreign policy tradition. The subtitle of that is Armed Diplomacy, Jefferson, Polk, Reagan, and of course Harry Truman. I should mention just quickly some of the aspects of the career of Professor Nau, and he mentioned, by the way, that he's been thinking about these questions related to tonight's topic in the most recently published book since the very earliest days of his thinking about such things. And in his book, he makes the remark that this is all like running a marathon with no finish line. The careers of many people take on that particular character. He's a graduate of MIT with a degree in economics, politics, and science. His master's and PhD degrees are from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's taught at Williams very early in his career, been at George Washington for a long time, been a visiting professor at a number of major institutions, Stanford, Columbia, SAIS again. Only a year or two ago, he was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. In short, his academic career has been most interesting and impressive. His publications I alluded to, and they've covered these major aspects of the analysis of any foreign policy. I should perhaps also note his participation in government very early on. He was at the State Department as a senior assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He later was in the National Security Council as their senior staff person on international economic affairs during Reagan years. And I think that perhaps the most telling aspect of all of this is that ongoing and serious attention to the major elements that will be discussed this evening. It's a great pleasure to present to you Professor Henry Nau.
Thank you indeed. Thank you very, very much. It's a real delight to be here at the Baltimore Council, and especially to be here again with Frank Bird. You have two institutions here, the Baltimore Council and Frank Bird. He has superintended 3 of my books now, and I just mentioned to him earlier tonight he better stick around because there's another one coming somewhere down the line. But it is a pleasure to be here. And Frank, I'm indebted to you for having given me a wonderful segue here about the year 1910. I have been trying to think about some way to say this, and my wife said, oh, don't do that. But today is my father's birthday, and he was born on October the 8th, 1910. Would have been 103 years old today. He died about 12 years ago, but he hasn't really died. He stayed very close to me and to all of us. I want to warn you before I begin by telling you a little story about Dwight Eisenhower. He had, I thought, a very good feel for people and maybe especially for intellectuals. So he had a definition for academics like me, or sometimes we say policy wonks who would come in to talk to him about problems. And he said, you know, those guys, those intellectuals, he said, they are people who talk for much too long, use too many words to tell you more than they actually know. So I'm hoping now I don't live up to Dwight Eisenhower's definition of an intellectual, but I may. It's kind of it's in my DNA, I suspect. Let me start with a dire prediction, sort of to get your attention. I think we are in the United States repeating an old historical pattern in our involvement in the world of, on the one hand, first overreach, overexpansion, over-involvement in the world, and then followed very rapidly by withdrawal, under-involvement, returning home from the world. 10 years ago, the American people, and now I'm talking about us as well as our leaders, voted overwhelmingly to get heavily involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. Today, 10 years later, or 11 years, 12 years later in the case of Afghanistan, we're voting overwhelmingly again to hightail it home and never again to put boots on the ground in Syria, in Somalia, in Libya, wherever. Now, I'm going to suggest that that's a mistake. In that regard, I'll be a little critical of President Obama's foreign policy, but I think he represents more a condition in which we have found ourselves over and over again historically. So I don't want to put all the blame on his shoulders. It's happened, by the way, after World War I, after World War II, after Korea, and after Vietnam. That is, in the case of all of those events, we stayed at home until we were attacked. Then we went abroad with a vengeance to defeat and then try to democratize the aggressors. And then after we thought we had done that, we left, confident that either international institutions could take over for us or that other countries would step up and share the burdens. Think about it. After withdrawing from the world in World War I, what happened to us 2 decades later? Pearl Harbor. After the end of World War II, think about what we did. We demobilized rapidly, came home, turned over to the world the United Nations. What followed? The Berlin blockade and the Cold War. Think about it. Korea. We actually never came home from Korea, but Dwight Eisenhower came into office and said, listen, we have to cut back. We have to spend less on defense. We have to do more to kind of reduce our activity in the world. And we did under his guidance to some extent. And what happened, we were confronted in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the way, the crisis that brought us closest to nuclear Armageddon that we have ever come. And after the Vietnam War, what happened? The Soviet Union began to, as never before, project its military power into Africa. It invaded Afghanistan, and for a while it took over South Vietnam. That is, it established naval bases in Cam Ranh Bay and other places. So we have been repeatedly involved in this kind of a cycle or this kind of a pattern. And I worry greatly that we're in the process today of putting in the bank these kinds of problems for the future. That is, that we're going to get hit again in the future if we continue to back up. If we continue to think that by somehow reducing our world and our role in the world, we can avoid the world. Now, why do we do this? Why do we do this over and over again? I'm going to argue it's because we have something missing in our thinking and in our debate about American foreign policy. It's something which has been there, by the way, all along, as I'll show historically, but it's been relatively neglected. And that is a tradition that I will call conservative internationalism. We have two main traditions, all right, that influence our debate and our thinking about American foreign policy. And I want to argue that it's those two traditions that kind of yank us back and forth into and out of the world, all right? The one tradition is the realist or nationalist tradition, which tells us don't get overly involved in the world. Take care of America, defend this country, maybe worry about this hemisphere, but don't get too heavily engaged because there's not a lot of good things out there. There's a lot of conflict, there are a lot of different groups, a lot of countries, and it would be better for us if we just simply took care of ourselves. Now, realists go a little bit further, because they say, wait a minute, we've got to worry about threats that may be developing in Europe and Asia. So we have to be a little bit preemptive about what may be developing out there. But all we should really do is go out there and try to stabilize things, try to balance power. We're never going to change the character of the world. All right? That's kind of a pessimistic view of the world, and it's one that causes Americans at various times, as I've suggested, to say, hey, wait a minute, why do we need to be involved? Why don't we just take care of ourselves here? Or do minimal sorts of things in Europe and Asia. We may be on the cusp of that kind of an approach right now. But then there's a second tradition. It's the liberal internationalist tradition. By the way, the realist and nationalist tradition, it's identified with Andrew Jackson. It's identified with the Monroe Doctrine. More recently, it's identified with Nixon and Kissinger. All right, that's the realist tradition where you play the game of power to protect yourself, maybe in a limited way if you're Andrew Jackson or a proponent of the Monroe Doctrine, but also in a more involved way if you're a realist and you want to work with other great powers the way Nixon and Kissinger did, but always just to stabilize the world, always just to preserve the status quo. You never can really change the fundamental character. It'll always be anarchic, the world will always be anarchic, and it'll always involve many kinds of other countries. Most importantly, despots as well as democracies. Now, the liberal internationalist tradition tells us exactly the opposite. It says, no, Americans, we can go out there in the world and we can actually make the world better. We can actually promote freedom in the world. We can actually make countries free and different and better. And we can do that largely by international institutions, by negotiations, compromise, and international institutions. Now, this is the tradition that's associated with Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the United Nations. And it's a tradition that tells us that, we can make a difference and we can spread democracy, but we can do it largely through international institutions. In fact, we must do it largely through international institutions. We don't want to be too heavily involved in the use of military force. In fact, we want international institutions to engage in disarmament, and we want to then use military force only as a last resort. Only, in fact, if all of our efforts at negotiations do not succeed. Now, that's the tradition that kind of tells us, hey, come on, we can get in there and do it. Let's go. And we can shape the world, a different world, through these international institutions and through international law. Well, these two traditions have kind of got us, on either side. And at various times they pull us into the world, and at other times they yank us back into the world. Now, I want to suggest that there may be an intermediate tradition, which has been around for a while, certainly since the time of the beginning of the Republic. I'll identify it to some extent with Thomas Jefferson. And it kind of tries to combine some of the elements of liberal internationalism and realism, but does it in a very disciplined way. That is, does it in a conservative way. All right, and I'm going to emphasize that adjective as I go along. And what it suggests is that we can take the objectives of liberal internationalism, because I think, as you'll see in a minute, we all really believe that freedom is not just for Americans. It's really something that's available for all human beings everywhere. And we should probably, if we can, be about the business of spreading that freedom. But it combines that objective with some of the realism, with some of the military power of realism. That is, it arms our diplomacy because it knows that we're going to be dealing with despots, with authoritarian countries. And those authoritarian countries use force daily, police force, in their own countries, and they will use military force against us if they get a chance. Ronald Reagan always had a wonderful, as he was so good at, clip way of saying this. He would say, my gosh, if they treat their people that way, think of what they might do to us if they get the chance. So we need to be realistic about how we're going to have to work to improve the prospects of freedom in the world. But we must do this in a conservative way, that is, in a disciplined way. We can't spread freedom everywhere at the same time. And we can't afford to use force in every situation, every time. We have to have some rules that govern where we prioritize freedom and how we use force in connection with our diplomacy. And when, in fact, we not only arm our diplomacy, but we also end our use of force with timely diplomacy. That is, we switch that back and forth. We have to arm our diplomacy to get the attention of our adversaries, but then we have to, at the right moment, cash in our military gains for diplomatic gains. And in that way, keep the costs of all of this manageable. Otherwise, our efforts to try to spread freedom become Pollyannish, and they become excessively costly, as they have been for us over the last 2 decades in Afghanistan and Iraq. So let me identify 4 main parts of conservative internationalism and identify each of these elements of conservative internationalism with one of the presidents that I studied. First, let me tell you what I mean by conservative. Let me define that term, all right, and how it differs from liberal. And here Thomas Jefferson is going to be very helpful. Second, what do I mean by internationalism? And here I want to differentiate between internationalism, that is both kinds of internationalism, conservative and liberal, and realism and nationalism. I've already indicated what I think one of those main differences is. Ronald Reagan is my example here. 3, I want to tell you how conservative internationalism would arm its diplomacy with force to spread freedom without going overboard and overburdening the American public. Here I think both Reagan and Harry Truman are good examples. And 4, how does conservative internationalism accompany the use of force with diplomacy? That is, how does it end wars as well as starts them if necessary? How does it cash in military leverage through compromise to move the needle in the world towards freedom, all right, even if we don't get everything we want? And here the president that really is an extraordinary example in my judgment is Polk, is James K. Polk, known of as a war president, Mexican War, but you'll see in a minute why I think Polk has some real lessons for us. Now first, what do I mean by conservative? You know, this is kind of a bit confusing because in a sense, all Americans are liberals. Now what do I mean by that? I mean what Louis Hartz meant. He wrote a wonderful book called The Liberal Tradition in America about 60 years ago. And he meant that all Americans are classical liberals. classical liberals. That is, we believe in individual freedom, not the authority of the state or the authority of the church or the authority of the crown. That's the Enlightenment. That's the legacy of the Enlightenment. And we believe in political equality. That's the legacy, not class or social discrimination in politics. That's the legacy of the Declaration of Independence. Now, I think all Americans, except maybe for a few, but the vast majority of Americans believe that, all right? And there is no, in contrast to Europe, there is no far-right fascist party in America. There just isn't. There never has been. Hartz was the one who laid this out initially in his book. Okay, there's some fascist elements like there were some communist elements, but there was no significant fascist party. There was no significant communist party in this country. While Europe lurched back and forth between the far right and the far left, in the process, by the way, destroying its classical liberal center, America retained its classical liberal center. Both of our parties are centrist parties. I'll make that clearer to you because that doesn't seem right today. We're so far apart. We're so polarized. No, we aren't. No, we aren't. We're much closer together. Even Obama said just 1 year ago, the differences between the parties are not as great as they seem. And they're nowhere near as great as they were in Europe, all right, for many decades, centuries. And they're not nearly as great as they were in this country in the first decade of the history of this country, the 1790s. And good Lord, we know they aren't as great as they were in this country in the 1850s and in the 1860s. So we need to keep some perspective on this question of partisanship. Yet American conservatives and American liberals do differ in two very important ways. All right? We're all classical liberals, but we're all not social liberals. All right? Conservatives in America are more Republican liberals. That's with a little r. They're people who believe in limited government. All right? And social liberals are those who believe in more activist government. And those are key differences. Now here, this next slide kind of illustrates those differences and how you can show the differences among Republicans and between Republicans and Democrats in terms of these two factors. What I want to suggest is that American conservatives, by the way, differ, all right, in terms of their relative emphasis on individualism versus limited government, and in terms of their emphasis on the role of reason versus the role of religion or tradition in public affairs. Now, liberals are off this chart, all right, in the sense that they believe in much more activist government than is depicted on this chart, and they believe to some extent in group rights as well as individual rights, right? And compared to conservatives, they tend to put more stock in reason and in science and in expertise as the way to sort of make public policy decisions, whereas conservatives are more skeptical about human knowledge and about the human possibilities. And they therefore see a bigger role for judgment in and decisions in religion, or if they're not religious, in virtue, in political philosophy. So they tend to be somewhat more skeptical that we can actually know what's best for human society and that somehow we can perfect human society. Liberals are going to be much more optimistic about the degree to which we can study and understand society and improve society. Liberals tend to see social science as an objective science or a potentially objective science. Conservatives are always going to wonder, how can it be objective when in fact we are studying ourselves? That is, we are studying people, and therefore we're studying things we like and dislike. You know, scientists don't study things they like and dislike. They study quarks. They don't like or dislike quarks. But you and I, we study parties, we study unions, we study churches. We like or dislike them. So it makes, I think conservatives would say there's an argument here, and it should be listened to. Now, therefore, if that's the big difference between liberals and conservatives, all right, liberals are just much more inclined to think that we can get to the answers through expertise, maybe even ultimately through scientific methodologies. Conservatives are going to say, no, you know, in the end, you're going to have to make some judgments, moral judgments based on religion and virtue and tradition, and it'll not all depend upon reason. On the other hand, liberals are going to say we need a lot more activist government, we need more social equality, and conservatives are going to say no, we need more limited government because we're more concerned about personal liberty. So think about it this way. Liberals will, in the crunch, often give the benefit of the doubt to social equality over individual freedom. All right? If it means a few more restrictions on an individual freedom, that's okay, as long as everybody can be treated equally socially and have similar circumstances socially. All right? I'm saying in the crunch, they make that choice. Nobody wants either one or the other, but liberals will come down on more social equality. Conservatives will come down on more individual freedom. They'll say, you know, I'll accept more social inequality as long as I, you know, have freedom to be what I want to be. Now, they both believe in equality of opportunity. So we're talking here about equality of results in the case of the most aggressive sort of social advocates, and on the other hand, the maintenance of personal freedom in the case of the aggressive advocates on the conservative side, the most sort of libertarian groups in the Republican Party. Now, you can actually picture the groups in the conservative movement in America today on this chart. By the way, there's a chart in the book that depicts this for liberals, all right? But since the book is about conservative, and I told you I was going to emphasize conservative, we're focusing here on the conservatives. You know, you can place all of the contemporary participants in the debate about American foreign policy and about American domestic policy on this chart. You have the libertarians, that's Rand Paul and Ron Paul, his father. You have the social conservatives, that's Santorum and Michelle Bachmann and maybe Newt Gingrich and others who belong in that camp, maybe Governor Huckabee. You see him on TV a lot. Up in the right-hand corner, you got the economic or fiscal conservatives. All right, that's where I would put people like Romney and probably also my former boss, Ronald Reagan. They believe very strongly in maintaining limited government and keeping the size of government down. And they believe in sort of a majoritarian kind of democracy. Let the people decide. I'd put Jefferson in this box too, by the way, although he was also very libertarian. So he's probably right in the middle, up above the horizontal line. Finally, you get the reform conservatives. Now, you get people like Richard Nixon. He was the one who created the EPA. Do you know that? Did you realize that? He created the Office of Economic Opportunity. Gosh, some pretty liberal programs. And George W. Bush, he created the prescription drug program and was, of course, very adamant about bringing the national government into education, which has traditionally been a local government responsibility. So there are reform conservatives who believe in more activist government, but they don't believe in quite as much activist government as most Democrats do, as most social liberals do. Now, you can, so on the foreign policy side too, you can identify the different points of view. You get Pat Buchanan down here, on the left-hand side of the diagram, and you of course get, Sean Hannity probably here on the lower left-hand side. So you can, play with this, but it's a spectrum. These aren't dichotomous categories, so you can place just about everybody on there. And they differ to some extent on domestic as opposed to foreign policy, but there's a thread that runs through both domestic and foreign policy, by the way, for conservatives and for liberals, all right? And that, in other words, domestic ideology is important for how you think about foreign policy. And here, my best example for you is Jefferson. I love Jefferson, you'll find that. I love Jefferson and Reagan, and you'll have to forgive me, that's my passion. But Jefferson had a wonderful way of kind of expressing the conservative philosophy. On the question of limited government, listen to this, what he said in his first inaugural. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. How then can he be trusted with the government of others? Wow, that says it all for a conservative. Let's take care of ourselves first, our families, our neighborhoods, our churches, all right, and then we'll take care of what we need to, at the national level. But if we can't take care of what we need to by ourselves, that is, or that which is closest to us, we have no business trying to run the country, all right, from the national level, telling other people how to behave. He, by the way, carried that over into the international arena. He said, we don't necessarily want countries to emerge out here in the territories, all right, beyond the Alleghenies, beyond the Mississippi. He says, we don't necessarily want countries that'll join the Union. We want sister republics. And as he put it, he said, we want them, keep them in the Union, that is, bring them in the Union, if it be for their good, but keep them separate if it is better. He was indifferent. He was looking at a world not organized hierarchically, but a world organized in terms of sister, by the way, democratic republics. He was thinking about republics with a little r, which in those days, by the way, was the word for democracy. Now, he also believed very strongly in the public square. He was, by the way, not a religious man. I shouldn't say that. He was an atheist, but he was religious. All right? The difference. He was a deist, I should say. He was a deist rather than an atheist. But he acknowledged the strong role and importance of religion. On the other hand, he believed that the way you let problems, both moral and other problems, be resolved is you let them be resolved by the people. You let them be resolved in the public square. You let people debate them, and Jefferson had a remarkable faith as an aristocrat and a slaveholder. He had a remarkable faith in those days, ordinary, uneducated white people who he thought should vote. He thought had every right in the world to vote, even if they, in his case, even if they didn't own property. Now, he wanted to educate those people. That's why he cared more about the University of Virginia, he said, than the office of the presidency. But he genuinely believed in expanding the realm of freedom where it was being, all right, where the battle was being fought in his day, which was to bring more and more white male citizens into the franchise. You have to remember that. Okay, he was a slaveholder. Yes, he was not for, voting rights for blacks or for women, but that's where the battle was in a different place in those days. And compared to some of the other founding fathers, Jefferson was very clear about the fact that he expected more and more white male citizens to vote and to participate. And I think he was also, we know he was troubled, all right, by what that meant in the long run for black Americans, for slaves. And even though he didn't mention it explicitly, at least that I can recall, he had the same sentiments about women in the long run. But, we can't judge these people by standards today. That's just completely wrong. You have to go back 200 years. So he believed, in other words, that you could let every point of view be expressed in the public square and let the people decide. He had another great way of putting that, again in his inaugural. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, he's talking about treason now, let them stand undisturbed as monuments to the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. That's a remarkable belief for a gentleman in the 1780s, the 1790s. He never, by the way, he didn't believe that courts and experts should have a big role in American democracy. Now, that's where he's conservative as opposed to liberals. Liberals believe maybe courts and experts should have more role in public policy. For example, when the Federalist government under John Adams passed the Sedition Acts, which put 300 of Jefferson's supporters and members of the Republican Party at that time in jail, all right, with no habeas corpus, no Federalist journalists, only Republican journalists. All right, Jefferson could have been outraged, and he was, but he took it to the American people. And later he said, there's no need to go to the courts because the elections of 1800 and of 1804 have given the public verdict. The public square has spoken. I don't have to go to the courts to make sure that these laws are ruled unconstitutional and therefore never happen again. Well, fortunately for us, except for a few moments with habeas corpus in the case of Lincoln and also in the case of Roosevelt, we haven't engaged in that kind of behavior, and especially not as clearly one-sided as it was in the case of the Sedition Acts. Alien and Sedition Acts, that was against both foreigners and against Americans. Now, let me secondly talk about what I mean by internationalists. And I've already alluded to that, and I want to keep it quite simple. I'm already violating Dwight Eisenhower's admonition here. We've already suggested that internationalists are people who believe that you can actually move the needle of freedom forward in the world, all right? And they want to change the world. Eventually, they believe that if you create enough countries that are democracies, you will bring about a democratic peace. You'll bring about a world in which countries do not settle their issues with one another through military means. And by the way, there's a strong body of political science literature that supports that idea. As countries become more solidly democratic, they do not threaten each other, either with the use of force during disputes or let alone use force actually against one another. If that's true, then internationalists, of course, are onto something. Now, nationalists and realists think that you should never make the change of a regime in another country the focus of your foreign policy. That's very dangerous. It's going to increase dramatically the costs of foreign policy. It's going to increase the dangers of foreign policy, especially in a nuclear world. So they offer some very good counsel here. Be careful and just let other people be if they let you be. All right? Now that's the fundamental difference between internationalists and nationalists. Now the problem for us arises. Let me go to the. To some extent, the problem arises with Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan was neither a liberal internationalist, that is, he strongly criticized Jimmy Carter, for example, and did not believe that you could spread democracy primarily by international diplomacy and international institutions. On the other hand, he also wasn't a Richard Nixon. He also wasn't a realist. He strongly criticized containment, because he didn't believe that the only purpose of American foreign policy was to preserve peace, that is, was to stabilize the status quo and just get along with despots. He actually believed that you should try to change the character of the domestic regime of countries. And that was what was unique about his Soviet policy, and maybe one of the ingredients that made his Soviet policy ultimately successful. That is, he believed that the United States should do everything in its capability to move the Soviet Union towards more political and economic pluralism. And he stated that very clearly in two of his key national security study directives while he was president, NSDD 32 in May of 1972 and NSDD 75 in January of 1983. No other president had made that objective the core of his foreign policy. And Reagan was very clear. On the 40th anniversary of the Yalta Agreement, for example, in February of 1985, he issued a declaration in which he said, we'll never recognize the legitimacy of the border in Central Europe. We'll never recognize. That's an illegitimate border, right? And these countries beyond the Iron Curtain, they are going to be free someday. So Reagan had this idea that somehow or other you could change regimes, move them towards democracy. You didn't have to settle for just working with international institutions and hoping that in the long run they become democratic. And you certainly didn't have to settle just for containment. You could, in fact, significantly move the world towards more democracy. Now, how do you do that? How do you do that in ways that are, by the way, Reagan used to say, now that doesn't mean that you don't concentrate first on democracy in America. Because he had a way of saying, he had a way of putting that. He said, you know, guess what? If we lose democracy in this country, where do we go? He says, you guys got any ideas? Where do we flee? You lose democracy in other countries, and where do they go? They come here. So he understood you had to first secure democracy in America. That's, by the way, a good nationalist premise, which Reagan understood. But he also understood that you can't have real freedom here if you don't care about freedom abroad. I mean, America is less and less, by the way, a coherent racial group, all right? Within a few years, we're going to be 50% or more non-Anglo-Saxon, non-white. So we are, if anything now, increasingly an idea, and we're an idea that mirrors the racial and ethnic makeup of the world. So if we're serious about our freedom, we're going to have to be concerned about the freedom of others abroad. Now, but how do you do this? This is my third point that I want to make. How do you do this in a way that is reasonable? That is, in a way that doesn't overload us, because we can't take on everybody's freedom. We can't. work in the world on behalf of everybody and try to, as George W. Bush said, I think mistakenly, in his second inaugural address, end tyranny in all countries, everywhere. That is not possible. We don't have the resources, we don't have the insight, we don't have the judgment, we don't have any other capabilities for doing that, all right? But how do we do it? Well, we do it, I think, in four ways through what I have called conservative internationalism. That is, we try to discipline now this internationalism, all right, that is in our DNA, because we care about freedom, and not just ours, but also the freedom of the world. So how do we discipline that? Well, we do it by, we know, by the way, we know it's going to take the use of more force than probably we would like. Why? Because we're going to be trying to move the needle of freedom forward in the world against despots. Do you think they're going to like that? Do you think they're going to cooperate with us on that? I doubt it. And they use force pretty consistently, pretty regularly. So the question is, how are we then going to bring that force to bear without, once again, overloading our capabilities? All right. Here are the principles that I think have to be followed if we're going to do this conservatively, if we're going to discipline this. First of all, we're going to have to decide, where is freedom more important than elsewhere? That's a tough decision to make, but we have to do that. And the way we do that, I argue, is, the third point up here, is to give priority to the spread of freedom in countries that border on existing free countries. Now, that means principally the countries in Europe that are now on the dividing line between free countries in the West and more authoritarian countries in the East, like Russia, and the same dividing line in Asia between the free countries of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, obviously Australia, some of the struggling democracies in Southeast Asia, and an authoritarian, no question about it, China, that continues to rule its country by a one-party mechanism. Now, there's a third maybe border of existing freedom, but it's a little different, and I think we have to think about it somewhat differently, and that is the border around Israel in the Middle East, Israel being the only real democracy in the region. But let's think for a moment about the borders in both Europe and Asia. Here I'm talking about countries like Ukraine or Turkey, all right, really critical countries today in terms of how they go. How will they come out of this struggle? Because believe me, there's a struggle going on for the hearts and minds of those countries right now, between an authoritarianism to the east and a liberalism to the west, and to some extent they've got those elements mixed up in their own soul, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. Korea remains an incredibly important country, because someday, South Korea, by the way, I would consider to be a very robust democracy, has opposing parties that rotate in power now peacefully, but someday something's going to happen in Korea. That peninsula is going to unite one way or the other. The question is going to be, at that time, will Korea get sort of sucked into a more authoritarian relationship with China? Or will it, in fact, become wholly united and free, like Europe, and be part of the Western world of free societies? Now, the point is, we should keep our eye on those countries. Doesn't mean we don't deal with problems in other parts of the world, all right? So if we're confronted by threat in Afghanistan, as we were, all right, and as some people thought we were in Iraq, we go into those countries and we deal with threat, but we don't stick around to try to build Jeffersonian democracies in those countries. Why? Because it's not because those countries can't become free. They're just as capable of being free as any other countries, all right? But it's because they are in remote regions, distant from existing countries. It's going to be much more costly. You don't have the advantages of powerful, proximate democratic societies and free markets like you have in Europe. Think of the enormous influence that the European Union has had and role it has played in bringing democracy to Eastern Europe and hopefully in the future to Ukraine and maybe Turkey. It's had an enormous, it's done more for the spread of free markets and democracy than almost any other thing, because it's right next door. All right? Think about Japan and its influence on South Korea and Taiwan, and of course the United States in that region. So where powerful democracies are present and powerful free markets, you have the best chance to spread democracy at the least cost. If you're going to try to do this in remote regions like Afghanistan or Iraq or maybe Somalia or Libya or Egypt, you're going to have a much, much harder time. And I don't think that the American people or any people will accept the costs of something like that. So this is a rule that I'm suggesting, a conservative rule by which you discipline where, in fact, you prioritize the spread of freedom. Now, the other rule that is absolutely crucial is in disciplining the use of force. Now, the use of force is absolutely essential from a conservative internationalist perspective. The use of force in negotiations, not the use of force after negotiations. Why? For three reasons. All right? You're dealing with despots, don't forget. You're dealing with non-democracies, the key opponents of the United States in negotiations. Number one, you need force in order to suggest to them that they can't achieve their objectives without negotiations. This was the purpose of Ronald Reagan's defense buildup. He wanted to say to the Soviet Union, look, you're not going to be able to achieve your objectives. That is, you can't win an arms race if you don't negotiate with us. All right? In other words, you're not going to succeed unless you negotiate with us. If the Soviet Union had thought that it could get what it wanted, all right, outside of the negotiations, why would it ever negotiate? All right, so the buildup concentrated the minds of the Soviet Union, and we know now how important that was in the mind of Gorbachev. 6 months after Gorbachev comes to power, he tells the Politburo, gentlemen, there's one thing we cannot afford to do. We cannot afford to get caught up in another arms race with the United States. We will lose. So Reagan had made his point, number one. Number two, and by the way, that became the premise for then successful negotiations, not to bust up negotiations, but successful negotiations. Secondly, Reagan said, look, while we're negotiating, if you push at me somewhere on the ground outside the negotiations, like freedom fighters in Central America or invading Afghanistan, I'm sorry, not freedom fighters, but communist proxy forces in Central America, or freedom fighter, Soviet forces in Afghanistan. If you try, in other words, to push forward on the ground and get ahead while we're negotiating, I'm going to push back. So, for example, the Soviet Union had already deployed, intermediate nuclear weapons, SS-20s in Eastern Europe, all right, when Reagan came into office. And Reagan said, look, he asked him, he said, let's negotiate. Let's negotiate a 0-0. Let's get rid of those weapons. The Soviet Union looked at him and said, yeah, sure. We've got, they had something like 700 of them already at that time. You got none. I'm sorry. We're going to move ahead. And so they did. So Reagan said, hey, we're not going to get them to negotiate until we push back, until we show them that we can deploy our own weapons. And of course, by 1983, the end of 1983, he had succeeded in leading NATO to deploy the INF weapons. Now, once they were deployed, what do you think happened? Well, the two countries got together and they eventually reduced them to 0. Exactly what Reagan had proposed initially, but with no pushback. He was determined to push back because that was the only way he was going to get a successful negotiation. All right, and finally, it's not mine. I remember this time to turn mine off. I never do, but. And the third reason you need force is because you need something to negotiate with at the table, at the bargaining table. For Reagan, this was the miracle of the Strategic Defense Initiative. I mean, this was an extraordinarily powerful tool that Reagan brought to bear. And that he made it clear to the Soviet Union that he wouldn't just take off the table, he wouldn't just give it up, but he was perfectly willing to share it. Now, the Soviets didn't believe it, Gorbachev didn't believe it. I think there was a problem there that Reagan didn't fully consider. I don't think I would have believed it if I'd have been Gorbachev. But Reagan's idea was, look, this is powerful. This is going to stop, someday it's going to stop offensive nuclear weapons, especially if we can reduce the number of offensive nuclear weapons. Then potentially defensive systems will be robust enough that they will be able to protect us. And if I share it with you, and with other major powers, we can each do that. We can each deter the other by having big defensive systems with very few offensive systems, and we'll have a system of deterrence which is actually more humane than the one that existed. As you know, the system that existed was one where you had big offensive weapons and no defensive systems. And why was that? So that we could promise each other we'd destroy each other's populations and industry. Well, Reagan always, when he heard that for the first time, or when he began to think about this for the first time, even before he became president, while he was governor, his aides say he just shook his head and said, my God, that's the most insane thing I've ever heard. Now, his view may still not have been realized, but it was a pretty interesting view, and it was why SDI was such a powerful concept. Well, let me tell you something. The Soviets took Reagan seriously, and that was the reason why he was successful in those negotiations. Now, last point. It took something else, however. Not just the willingness to use force to make sure that the negotiations succeed, but the willingness to accept compromise and to accept it at a timely moment when your leverage is greatest, understanding that over time your leverage is probably going to dissipate. Now here was Reagan, again, very, very clearly said to his hardliners, and writes this in his diary, listen, fellows, I am going to negotiate at some point. And I am going to make a compromise at some point. I didn't come into this office to destroy the Soviet Union militarily. But I don't think I'm an appeaser, he said. I think I'll get a good deal. Trust me. Most of them did. Few of them didn't. But Reagan's view was, look, we're going to make a compromise. We're going to give the Soviet Union a way out without trying to destroy them. And that way out was his promise with Gorbachev to reduce offensive systems, maybe all the way to zero, and to bring the Soviet Union into the global economy. That is, to bring them into the information age, by the way, which had been kicked off by the revival of the American economy under Reagan and the revival of the global economy. That was a pretty good vision, and Gorbachev accepted it. And the Soviet Union came peacefully into the system because now it was pretty clear they were not going to achieve any other objectives outside the negotiations. So this idea of being ready when you use force in your diplomacy, when you arm your diplomacy, and as I've suggested, I think that's the realistic thing you have to do if you are going to negotiate with despots. You are always looking for a way to give them a compromise and a way out. The president who really stands out here is James K. Polk. He was remarkable in this regard. Most people don't even know he was a president. My students, most of them never even heard of him. But he fought the Mexican War. He's best known for that, I suppose, although he also, negotiated for the acquisition of the Oregon Territory. He was like Jefferson, the man who built the contemporary United States. In the end, there's no, you can make a case for America's policy in the Mexican War, and I try to do that in my chapter. But I understand the critique of Polk, and I understand he was a slave owner, and I understand that by acquiring the Southwest Territories, there was the prospect that slavery would spread. But I'm talking about Polk's understanding now of how to negotiate. He first went to the Mexicans in the summer of 1845, and he said, look, I'd like to purchase these territories. And he offered a substantial sum, and he was dead serious in trying to purchase the territories, and he outlined very clearly what he wanted: New Mexico, Arizona, and Southern California. All right, he laid it out. He stayed he never went beyond those objectives, although he talked beyond those objectives, but in the end he came right back to those limited objectives. He wanted to purchase it. And do you know what? The Mexicans were on the verge. We were making progress with the Mexican government. All right, but then there was, as he made that offer, he of course sent a diplomat down to Mexico to negotiate the deal, Slidell, who was a congressman. And he was getting a deal until he gets to Mexico City and there's a coup. And the moderates are thrown out and the hardliners come in and the deal can't be concluded. Slidell sticks around for another 3 months trying every way he can under orders from Polk. Nothing comes about. So Slidell comes home and now Polk says, okay, I wanted to purchase it. I warned you that there might be other options if you were unwilling to negotiate. We went to war. Now, you can talk about how the war broke out, but anyway, we found ourselves very shortly at war. 3 more times during the war, Polk escalates the use of force, and each time he sends an envoy to Mexico. Now, this becomes very significant at the end, because in 1847 he sends Nicholas Trist, who was a clerk to the Secretary of State, James Buchanan, who had opposed Polk often in the conduct of this war. So Nicholas Trist wasn't even someone that Polk felt he could trust, but Polk said, nope, go down there, and I want you to try to negotiate now as U.S. forces were moving from Veracruz up to Mexico City. I want you to, try to negotiate an agreement. Well, we wind up in Mexico City in October of 1847. Nicholas Trist is still there, but he negotiates an agreement which goes way beyond that, as he wants to give up some of the territories that Polk had said were absolutely a prerequisite. He wanted to give up New Mexico. And so Polk said, absolutely not, and moreover, you're fired because you haven't followed my instructions. Well, Trist stays on, encouraged by the British and some others. He stays on, continues to negotiate. Now, Polk had every reason in the world to say, you're done, you're finished, I don't want to hear from you anymore. But lo and behold, Trist comes back in January of 1848, and he says, Mr. Polk, I've got an agreement here. And Polk looked at it and he says, by golly, and it's got the things that I originally wanted. He didn't stop for a moment, even though he had fired this guy, and this guy, by the way, had been personally insulting to Polk, and he says, I'll take it. Why? Because Polk understood we sat in Mexico City at that moment. All right, we could have taken the whole country. There was an all-Mexico movement in Congress which was at its peak at that time, urging Polk, do it, do it, do it. But Polk knew that his power was waning, his military influence was going to occupying this country for a long period of time. Oh my goodness, if we had understood that in the case of Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, right? He knew that he was at his best moment to try to cash in those military gains to get an agreement. And so he took the agreement, and do you know what? In 6 months, there wasn't a single American soldier left in Mexico City. Wow. Can you imagine if we had done that in Afghanistan or in Iraq? I mean, let's say 2 years, 3 years, we'd have gotten out. We wouldn't have left behind, by the way, a democracy, and it would have been a weak government, but it would have been no weaker than the one we're leaving behind now after 10 or 12 years. So when are we going to learn? When are we going to learn that you have to make these compromises in a timely fashion, and that's the whole purpose if you were forced to use military force by your negotiating partners who are despots and like to use force, then you need to also be ready to stop the use of force at the appropriate moment and to grab a compromise and go home. And Reagan used to always say, too, go back and get the rest the next day. He was ambitious. He figured he could get it all. But he was willing to take what he could get, half a loaf today, and go back for the rest tomorrow. Now, that's a lot of, it doesn't say much about President Obama, but maybe you can read between the lines. Because, you might say that Obama is a president, I guess I said this in a op-ed piece recently in the Wall Street Journal, who has never met a diplomatic opportunity he didn't like. I mean, he's been negotiating all over the place. He's picked up just about every, initially he sent all sorts of envoys around the world. He has grabbed hold of every opportunity to negotiate anything, and all that's fine and dandy. It's kind of the tendency of a liberal internationalist. But if you don't back it up with some force, if you don't back it up with a defense budget, if you don't back it up with some willingness to keep forces in play, and if you don't back it up with some leverage in your negotiations, like missile defenses, don't give them away before negotiations, as he may have done in the case of the New START agreement with Russia, then it's not likely that you're going to get your adversary's attention.
We thank you very, very much, Henry, for a marvelous night.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.